Analog horror completely reshaped horror on the internet, being a truly fresh approach that played off the unsettling aesthetics of old technology and the uncanny fear of forces beyond our comprehension, with an unparalleled sense of immersion, making it feel like you're an active participant in the twisted worlds they realize. However, nowadays, 10 years after the genre's initial rise, it's in a very different place, with many claiming analog horror is dead, simply writing it off as a tired, repetitive style that's been ruined by the same overused tropes and countless unscary try-hard series. But is that really true? Well, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. So today, let's go over the defining series of the genre, the community around it, how it could potentially recover, and everything else that's contributed to the supposed decade-long downfall, to answer that question once and for all. Debuting in 2015 and created by Chris Straub, Local 58 is essentially the godfather of analog horror. It not only coined the term, but also established the general vibe, visual direction, and most of the tropes that still define the genre today. Essentially, it's an anthology horror series presented through recordings of hijacked programming on the fictional Local 58 TV station, loosely connected by an overarching plot of the moon being an evil entity carrying out psychological warfare on Earth's residents. And Local 58 exists as a form of unfiction, something that, while obviously fake, presents itself in such a way you can suspend your disbelief and accept these as actual long-lost recordings documenting the insane happenings in a small, no-name part of America. It's a pretty fun and novel concept, with each video being really short and to the point. It gets in just long enough to set an unnerving mood, maybe provide a little bit of world building, before crescendoing with that episode's big scare that, more often than not, hits really effectively, as every single episode brings some new crazy concept to the table that is often extremely well realized with its perfect pacing and production values that effortlessly recreate the subtly unnerving feeling given off by old analog technology. One of my favorites would have to be "You're on the fastest available route," which puts us into the shoes of someone driving along using GPS instructions. Only as the video continually cuts further in time, we see it start to lead us off route to more and more desolate locations, with the low quality analog footage almost making it appear like there's figures hidden within the tree line, and the GPS's false instructions playing into the fear of technology that's such a common theme throughout all analog horror. The whole video there's this building tension till we finally reach the destination.
In 300 feet, turn off your headlights. Rerouting. Make a U-turn. Your destination is behind you. Rerouting. In 500 feet.
And I just love how this uses the analog format to create these subtle scares where you know something bad's gonna happen and your mind starts playing tricks on you, seeing things that aren't even there. It manages to make such an immersive, terrifying experience with what's essentially just some dashcam footage and a text-to-speech voice. And that super basic presentation is something that I think really connected with people, showing you don't need actors or a big budget to craft a phenomenal piece of internet horror. So really, it's no surprise that Local 58 inspired such an explosion of amateur creators making their own series after it. That being said, I do feel like one or two Local 58 videos, while cool conceptually, don't quite come together as well. For example, I want to talk about the second episode of the series, Contingency. One of the most iconic of the series' modest 11 episode count. It has a phenomenal concept and presentation, being a scheduled US emergency program to be played, quote, only in the event of United States surrender to insurmountable forces. The message scrolls past the screen set to an unnerving but believably distorted rendition of the US national anthem, where it orders all Americans to take action in persevering the US's memory and honor by taking their own lives, providing instructions on how to do it as the video slowly degrades further. It's a really effective and almost believable concept, fully and tastefully realized. But then the last 2 seconds have to push it further, saying to also take out children and pets, and then the screen starts like glitching out conveniently right at this moment, ending on a picture of a baby flashing on screen reading, "Infants and pets, the smallest patriots." And personally, I feel like this pushes things a little too far in terms of suspension of disbelief, and kinda kills the video, because there needs to be that last big scare. Even though the whole thing would have been way creepier if it stuck to the restrained, semi-realistic tone it had already executed so well. I know it's a small thing to most, but I want to focus on this because as you'll see later, This small issue is going to become a microcosm of some of the biggest problems with modern analog horror going forward. Despite coming out 4 whole years after Local 58, I'm counting Scrimpus McGrimpus's FNAF VHS as one of the OGs of analog horror, as it similarly pioneered and popularized tons of the major tropes seen in analog horror today. Rather than simply aping Local 58 like so many of this era would, it brings a unique format to the table, being a series of instructional in-universe tapes created by Fazbear Entertainment, which have been altered by the ghosts that haunt the establishment. At least I think that's what's going on. Yeah, this one comes equipped with a full-on plot, and it's essentially an adaptation of the fake story laid out in the first 3 Five Nights at Freddy's games, doing an amazing job capturing that very specific, off-putting atmosphere you get from playing them. And the analog aesthetic was already a part of the FNAF series, what with the 80s era camera systems and retro minigames, so it's a perfect fit. The very first in the series is one of its most iconic, being an instructional tape on dismantling animatronics for cleaning. There's already a somewhat unnerving vibe to the whole thing, with the distorted TTS and music, and Freddy's dingy, lifeless model slumped over the table. But then the big shock comes when his chest plate is removed to show something inside it. It's covered by a sensor bar, with just a little bit of blood seen behind, making for a really effective scare, leaving it for you to imagine exactly what it looks like without the sensor. Likely a much more vivid and disturbing image than any sort of mangled corpse they could actually show. Other episodes within the series include these cool in-universe cartoons, as well as animations made with the game's models and locations. And it's just generally really high effort and visually cohesive for an analog horror, even today. Its best known scare would have to be the criminal part. Our first appearance of the trademark analog horror spooky stretched face. Yeah, as with Local 58, I feel some of the concepts here, while effective at the time, but how much we'll see them used later kinda lose their impact. Like, to be honest, the second episode, I've heard people say this like made them lose sleep, but when the black and white, goofy looking face slowly fades in behind Chica with "I can't breathe" written on the screen, the whole thing felt so on the nose it just made me laugh, which I don't think was the intended reaction. But regardless, besides a few small issues like that, if you watch through the whole thing alone in a dark room, it can effortlessly immerse you within its world, like you're the protagonist watching these tapes. Something I think is the hallmark of any great analog horror. Another thing I loved about this series, as somewhat of a FNAF fanatic myself, was the realization of the characters from those games. In a series that's as purposefully cryptic as FNAF, you only ever get a vague sense for the personality and motivations of the characters within it, despite their concepts being so enthralling. So FNAF VHS takes the opportunity to give some much needed expansion on them. Integrated so seamlessly, I feel they've heavily influenced how people interpret the canon versions of them, especially of the main antagonist of the series, William Afton. With another extremely effective direction the series takes, which would be emulated so much later on, being William's monologue near the end. We have something that'll look very familiar if you've seen more than 2 analog horrors here, being a black and white, low quality, slightly off image of him as he describes his motivations and the lack of guilt for the murders he committed, portraying so much with so little. The phenomenal voice acting and lonely visuals set the tone perfectly.
Ever since he killed him, I've wanted to put my hands around his neck and just squeeze the life out of his lungs, but of course if I ever did that, I'd get caught.
But okay, I'm glazing this one way too hard. It's time to move on to the next examples from Generation 1 of analog horror, being those series inspired by the originals, fully cementing the basic tropes and direction of the genre, whilst attempting to put their own spin on things. Gemini Home Entertainment is a series that takes heavy inspiration from Local 58. Although I don't say that in a demeaning way, as this is another I quite enjoy. Its premise is similar in that it's an anthology horror series of short 4 to 8 minute videos loosely connected by some sort of cosmic horror, only this time instead of an evil moon it's a parasitic celestial body that seems to have already mutated several planets and sends parasitic alien plants to Earth which can take root within and take over human bodies. and instead of a local TV station, it's trolled through a series of VHS tapes produced by the titular Gemini Home Entertainment. There's a lot more hidden lore with this one, including a fully playable game that's diegetic to the series. But yeah, in general, early analog horror tended to include these super obscure but important details that the community needed to actively search out and work together to find, inspired by the previous most popular internet horror genre, ARGs. But these quickly became less prevalent as the genre grew into its own thing. Gemini has a consistent body horror team, and overall does a lot to push analog horror forward rather than just repeating what's been proven to work before, although it admittedly does that a little too. I particularly enjoy all the original footage used to realize the world in this one, using anything from full-on CG scenes to these simple infographics to get the more out there ideas across. The very first video, World's Weirdest Animals, does a great job setting up this series, beginning as a normal nature documentary before beginning to describe the alien wood crawlers taking root within America. There's great restraint as it describes their attributes, each one just a bit more off-putting than the last, till we finally get the full picture of just how terrifying a concept they are. Finally cutting to a video within someone's home, where you get to see just a glimpse of one of their giant, spindly, spider-like legs push inside before quickly cutting away. It's really well done and genuinely pretty creepy. Another episode, Home Invasion Hell, is our first major appearance of a home invasion segment in an analog horror. A framing device that does a great job grounding the otherworldly horrors presented. It's an effective trick for sure, and one that we'll see reused consistently in the series to follow. The video itself expands upon how the woodcrawlers take over homes, an already creepy concept, but it takes advantage of the format to put us in the shoes of someone exploring one of these infested houses. And it ends on this phenomenal shot of someone in the late stages of mutation by a woodcrawler, looking like nothing more than a mass of nerves. You think it's lifeless till the camera zooms in, and then its eye just barely moves to focus right on you before cutting away. This series is just full of these wonderful little moments that's built up to and given just enough context to maximize that sick, unnerving feeling that sticks in your mind long after the video's over. However, it'd be a gross exaggeration to say most series brought the same iterative spirit as Gemini. Many would pretty much just be straight up rip-offs of the concepts and visuals from series like Local 58, only completely missing the polish and, more importantly, subtlety which made them so effective in the first place. Comparing Local 58's weather warning video to the direct knockoff by the creatively titled Channel 7 makes this pretty clear. Both videos are of emergency broadcasts being hijacked by malevolent entities, but Channel 58 has a lot more going on beyond that simple concept. In its version, at first the alert urges viewers to remain inside and not view an ongoing meteorological event, what we know to be the moon. Then the broadcast glitches out and suddenly you see a message stating, "It's totally safe guys, you should go look at the moon, it'll be fun." And it's quickly pulled off. Then what's really cool is you see the entity and the guy at the TV station start fighting for control. I absolutely love this shot where half the screen is black, so as he types out "don't look at the moon," it reads "look at the moon," and then he has to quickly highlight it so you can see the full message. And then after it cuts out again, the guy who's typing sees the moon and gets possessed by it, and starts typing out messages encouraging you to look. "If you are afraid, we'll look together." Aw man, it's so cool. The concept is creepy, sure, but it's really the little simple narrative, escalating tension, and creatively utilizing the quirks of analog technology that elevate this one for me. Now let's see Channel 7's take on the same concept. This starts with another alert, with a TTS saying to stay inside, and then it orders not to look at any figures with no face, and don't look at blood red or other unseeable colors, and survival is futile if steps are not followed. Then it plays a loud siren sound with a quote alpha alert. And that's just the first 1 minute of the video. It really feels like throwing a bunch of scary concepts in your face, without any context or gravitas. And then, the same as Local 58, the entity hijacks the alert, only instead of the gradual, understated escalation of that one, it's, well, just take a look for yourself. I do feel a little bad singling out this one channel, and it's worth noting, it was the first attempt of a creator that went on to make multiple other much better series in the future. But I want to show this as an example of one of the many clones that popped up creating early analog horror, despite only having a surface level understanding of what made the defining series work so well in the first place. As, like we see today, even early on, there are a lot of series that boil the genre down to simply a handful of tropes and concepts to be regurgitated with minimal differentiation or creativity. I think this was caused largely because of how easy it is to make an analog horror series, at least in this sort of basic form. Realistically, all it required was a laptop with an editing program and some basic Photoshop or After Effects knowledge. Then you could look up some TV static and VHS filters, get a TTS voice, and boom, you can make your own Channel 58 in a few hours. So despite the occasional standouts like Gemini, it was clear the genre needed a serious shake-up if it was to survive into the 2020s. I consider these next two series to be the beginning of the second generation of analog horror, both for how much further they pushed analog horror in terms of popularity, as well as how pretty much everything after followed in their footsteps. To define Generation 2, for one, its projects were decidedly free from feeling the need to realistically emulate analog media. From here on, concepts become much more experimental, leaving the broadcast hijackings and informational tapes in favor for incorporating more mixed media and frequent live action or animated sequences that are more akin to short films. There's also a far bigger emphasis placed on the themes and ongoing narratives within each series, further setting each apart. The Mandela Catalog is undoubtedly the most influential and popular series in all of analog horror. It brought along with it the biggest spike in mainstream interest the genre has ever seen, as well as directly inspiring a seemingly endless slew of new projects that many would claim, along with the tropes it introduced, led to the downfall of the genre altogether. Now, I think the creator and his series gets way too much blame for this, mainly by virtue of him simply being the biggest name in the field. However, there is certainly some warranted criticism there. Really, I think the best way to sum everything up is just to take a look at the very first entry of the Mandela Catalog, Overthrown. Uploaded in 2021, this first video acts as a proof of concept for the series. Using an old Christian cartoon as its base, it utilizes a lot of the usual analog tropes to twist it into something that's been infected by this false god which has seemingly superseded or replaced the actual god and acts as the main antagonist throughout the series. Like everything in the Mandela Catalog, the concept and lore provided is awesome, but for how it's executed, well, it attempts to set an unsettling mood with the same creepy TTS voice trick we've seen used back as far as Local 58. Along with the glitching VHS effects and censorship that's inconsistently applied to the name and face of the false god. And then there's that scene.
I know what you've read.
Although the whole analog horror face had been used before, Mandela Catalog absolutely spams the heck out of it, especially early on. And to be fair, the alternates who impersonate humans but luck off to varying degrees are of course a big part of its plot, so it makes sense lore-wise. But I think what it and the following series who rely on it so much for their big scares tend to miss is why the uncanny valley they're trying so hard to emulate works in the first place. It's a phenomenon where practically every human feels a deep unease seeing something that is almost human but slightly off. Emphasis on slightly off. Time and time again when this trick is used, throughout analog horror, the face is completely exaggerated to an almost comical degree. It feels like the thought process is, if I make a face more distorted, it'll be more scary. But to me, and evidently a lot of other people, that's just not the case at all. And stuff like this, well, ends up being more unintentionally funny than bone-chillingly creepy. Now, although this is often pointed to as a poor implementation of the overused trope, and it doesn't work for me personally, it was an effective scare for a lot of other people at the time. I think largely because in this case, the horror isn't just from, whoa, big spooky face, but there's an element of unease from how the figure of the Virgin Mary and religion as a whole is being perverted and worn as a mask by the antagonist of the series. And similarly, back when it was used in FNAF VHS, I believe the intent was to portray how monstrous the image of William Afton appeared to his victims. So, like anything, this trope can be done well, even if it doesn't usually hit for me. I just think it requires a bit more restraint and narrative context and stuff like...
And remember, when you are not running, I'm only getting closer.
Yeah, But hey, this was just the first short video in a now 5-volume and almost 3-hour long epic that Alex Keister is still working on and improving with every episode. So despite early growing pains, there's a reason it's the most famous analog horror, and even if it's far from my favorite, it's definitely worth a watch. Over in the FNAF side of analog horror, another series that was just as genre-defining as the Mandela catalog came out 1 year before. Whereas FNAF VHS was a direct adaptation of the Five Nights at Freddy's story, the Walden Files uses it and analog horror itself as a base to make something wholly unique. This series is practically fully hand-drawn, with an awesome, decayed, filthy art style and purposely stilted puppet animation, giving the whole experience an off-putting vibe right from the get-go. And despite the supernatural elements, this series tells a distinctly human and tragic story, through many different formats. From in-universe cartoons, instructional tapes, audio recordings, and even a lengthy Petscop-inspired Let's Play. It makes full use of each episode's often near hour-long runtime to really allow you to stew in the impeccable atmosphere it builds. I mean, seriously, this thing is an absolute masterclass in both visual and audio design, used not only to execute great scares, but also to paint gut-wrenchingly depressing scenes as well. And to contrast my previous rant, I really want to highlight the found footage segment from episode 2. This near 7-minute sequence that follows 3 people heading into an abandoned animatronic storage facility to fix up the broken, maybe possessed robots. There is an awesome sense of escalation throughout this. First we get some casual dialogue as they look over the broken animatronics, and some are seen twitching in a way that's mechanical but just animated enough that they almost appear alive. Then later, one girl splits off to head into a back room, where we see more bots now looking much creepier in the dimly lit location, the slight hum building all the while. Finally she comes across a clown animatronic with a tape player installed, and you hear her voice becoming more shaky as she deliberates putting it in or not. Finally she does, and the tape is just so creepy.
Jack, Susan, Charles, Rosemary, Sophie.
Totally pushing the tension up as high as they can go till boom, big payoff. And only then does the clown slowly take off its faceplate to reveal a mangled, distorted face beneath. See, for me the distorted face jump scare works really well here, and I don't think it's necessarily the face itself, but rather everything surrounding it. The slow build-up, the suspense of whether the robots will spring to life or not, and wondering what's inside after it does. As well as the fact it's animated simply makes it fit much more naturally within the world. And the continually intensifying audio that's been building the whole scene just now reaching its climax. Everything just works together so well, and you can tell how much love and thought was poured into every aspect of this, as opposed to simply throwing a creepy face at you and expecting that alone to get a big reaction. Overall, this series consistently showcases a desire and ability to push analog horror forward, particularly with its innovative visual audio design, and man, that story is something else. Although it can be a bit hard to follow, with all the different names and stuff like hidden codes leading to unlisted videos and such. So maybe check out one of those analog horror explained videos after you watch it. Speaking of which, let's take a break from analyzing the content itself to take a look at what had just as big an impact on the genre, the analog horror community on YouTube.
You use the bricks.
Straw, sticks, or bricks.
So I did a little test here where I searched YouTube for the term analog horror and recorded the first 100 results. You want to guess out of that 100 how many were actual analog horror videos? 11. Yes, 11. That's basically 90% of the results being dominated partially by videos talking about analog horror like this one, but mostly videos by big creators summarizing analog horror series. You see, being that all analog horror calls YouTube home pretty much from its inception, it and YouTubers talking about analog horror have been linked in a sort of symbiotic relationship. For most of the biggest names in the horror space, you'll find that their biggest videos are these analog horror explained type videos, where they'll spend hours going over every single episode in a series, summarizing every little thing that happens, and finally spend the last 8% or so of the video terrorizing, and putting together their often cryptic plot lines for the viewer. Now, there's obviously varying degrees for how much any given creator adds substantive analysis to their series, but often I feel like these videos are almost like reaction videos with extra steps. And unfortunately, it seems most viewers treat them as replacements for the series that they're covering. I mean, look at the difference in views the most popular entry of any series has when compared to these summary videos. To be fair, at least most of the time, there is engaging commentary and theorizing in these videos, buried beneath the dry play-by-play descriptions. And especially nowadays, you'll see them include a call to action to check out the original series before their coverage, with it linked in the description. But my question is, if they really intended for you to watch the series they're covering before their video, why do they feel the need to spend hours restating and playing clips of every little thing that happens in it? Like, why does Nexpo need an hour and 38 minutes to go over the Walton Files' first 3 episodes, when MatPat covered the same material in a little over 30 minutes? Is the content of Nexpo's analysis really that much more profound that it needed to be 4 times longer? Honestly, I don't think so, but that's admittedly a subjective opinion. So let's be a bit more objective here. Out of the 1 hour 38 minute long video, how much of it is original commentary or analysis, and how much is simply describing what happens or just straight up playing long, uninterrupted clips? Well, I took it upon myself to watch this analysis with a timer, which I paused each time something original was added. And just to be extra charitable, I counted not only the intros, transitions, and 2 minutes of Patreon credits, as well as describing anything that you could feasibly miss on a first viewing as original content, including stuff like the 4 minutes spent reading out the partially censored letters from episode 3. And after adding everything up, the results were 58 minutes and 64 seconds. That's almost 60% of the video being either direct descriptions or long uninterrupted clips lifted from the episodes. Practically half the runtime of that section of the Walton Files. Like, what possible reason could you have to go back and watch the original after seeing this? None of its scares or plot twists that were so expertly executed are going to hit after you had some guy painstakingly describe and straight up show them to you in his video. Practically every worthwhile moment is shown here. Clearly not much for most, as this video sits at practically double the most viewed entry in the Walton Files. In this video, I've purposely kept my descriptions of the series vague and only spoiled 1 or 2 key moments. That's 1, because I don't want to cynically draw this video out, ruining its pacing just for potentially higher ad revenue, and 2, because I really do want you to go and seek out any of these series if they interest you, because despite all the criticism it receives, both within this video and from others, sitting alone in a dark room with a genuinely great analog horror is an incredibly fun, scary, and immersive experience that nothing else can really capture. Certainly not some cat on the internet summarizing it for you. So I'm not trying to just be a hater here. Nexpo certainly can make some cool videos. He's got great editing and narration, and he's capable of setting a strong atmosphere in most of his work. I only picked him for this example since he's one of the most popular of the horror analysis guys, so I felt it made for a fair comparison. But there's obviously other creators who'd fare much worse than this test. I just want to illustrate that these videos are undeniably taking away views from analog horror series that are clearly putting in far more effort to their videos than these people that simply repackage them. At the end of the day though, they're just making what their audiences very clearly want to see, even if I think the extreme imbalance of analysis to plot summary is certainly worthy of criticism. And I especially don't want to browbeat people who prefer to consume analog horror through these kinds of videos, as I have heard a few legitimate reasons for it, such as the actual analog horror being too intense for them, or simply needing someone to explain the series as their stories usually require a lot of active effort and focus for the viewer to follow. Okay, I know I was extremely critical there, but there's a reason I used the word symbiotic and not parasitic when describing the relation these videos have to the series they cover. You see, while a big channel covering your analog horror doesn't necessarily translate to much in the way of views, it does bring huge exposure to the series and its creators. And it seems like while a big amount of fans prefer to watch someone covering a series rather than the series itself, they are still fans of the series, and presumably, due to the often shocking content and how much ads would ruin the experience, analog horror videos are rarely monetized. No, instead the big analog horror creators seem to make a living through monetizing their series using other means like Patreon and merchandise. So overall, simply having more people aware of your series through someone like Wendigoon covering it translates to more people who will potentially pick up a plushie or spread the word online with stuff like fan art. even if they haven't seen the original upload. So although I feel these analysis videos could certainly be much better, they at least don't directly harm the analog horror creators they cover in any major way, which is why I think every creator is pretty chill with this being the status quo. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been any big drama like cases of copyright takedowns or anything like that. However, there is one other huge effect these analysis channels, and the wider audience in general, has had on analog horror. One that's a lot more subtle and I've never really heard discussed before. And that's the push for series to use the same tropes and push them to more and more ridiculous extremes that they're so often criticized for. I believe what we're seeing with analog horror is the very same thing that happened with mascot horror after the success of Five Nights at Freddy's, where it feels like some analog horror creators are willing to sacrifice the narrative in fear of their series to court these reactors, by purposely adding more difficult to decipher hidden details and convoluted lore, as well as more exaggerated, scary imagery and marketable monsters that can be plastered on a YouTube thumbnail and sold as a plushie. This obviously doesn't apply to every series, and in fact I think it's no coincidence the best ones that we'll get into later tend to avoid these pitfalls. But I definitely feel like there's this positive reinforcement where the analysis channels overplay their coverage like, oh my god, this is the scariest analog horror in years, and the wider internet latches onto these monster designs and specific clippable moments that go viral. But for me, I feel the need to make a series marketable like this kinda ruins the magic and spirit of unfiction that supposedly defines the analog horror subgenre. Next up is something special. The Monument Mythos by Manticore Tree was a much needed breath of fresh air for the genre. One of my personal favorite series we'll be going over today. This feels inspired largely by the early style of Local 58 in its approach to horror, but also includes the interesting narratives and intricate lore of the best Generation 2 stuff. In general, it uses a mix of the aesthetics synonymous with analog horror, like the grainy photos over dialogue, infographic style animation, and first-person found footage style, but they're all tastefully implemented with enough original added for it to stand on its own. It's an incredibly high concept series right from the get-go, with the basic concept being a peek into a world similar to our own, where among some very fun alternative history concepts, like J.D. Rockefeller being a previous US president, monuments around the world are alive and seemingly eating people. As funny as it sounds, and the series does manage to include some really funny stuff as well, which is another unique factor I really like about it. The production of these videos managed to make the idea absolutely terrifying. Overall, the series is very sparing with how much it actually uses scares, relying mainly on the story and the context you eventually gain as to what exactly is going on with these monuments that make them so scary. But if I am to give one bit of criticism, I feel like the quick cut after a big reveal like this is very overused throughout the series. Not a major issue really, just a tendency I noticed. I'm including this here to have something positive to talk about, because Monument Mythos was a major outlier at the time of release, and I'd be lying if I said most analog horror around this period reached its level of quality and uniqueness. There are two series which I feel perfectly represent the quality of an average analog horror series from Generation 2. In the initial drafts of this script, I gave each its own section, but they ended up sounding so similar I had to merge them into this singular chapter. In a way, that should already give you an idea of what the biggest problem with analog horror was at this time: a lack of originality. So, okay, the Smile Tapes is a series heavily inspired by the Mandela catalog, mainly its earlier entries, both in terms of visuals and basic plot synopsis. Its monsters are pretty blatant knockoffs of the alternates, being beings that kill and then replace humans, relying on the uncanny look of their imperfect replications to create pretty much all the horror throughout. And Basswood County is a series heavily inspired by the Mandela catalog, mainly its first few entries, which its plot bears striking resemblance to, with its monsters being blatant knockoffs of the alternates, relying on their imperfect, uncanny approximations of humans to create practically all their scares. You see what I mean? And I'm only being slightly reductive in my descriptions, as despite them both being relatively long series that garnered a lot of positive coverage at the time, there is very little plot to speak of here. The Smile Tapes documents the spread of a smile infection which causes people to smile really hard and turn into crazy zombie-like creatures that want to spread the infection further. But watching it really just feels like an excuse to throw progressively more disturbingly exaggerated PNGs of spooky faces at the viewer after some very minor setup with the same simple text on a black background that was already becoming a really tired trope. Basswood County's much of the same, substituting alternates for humanoids that function the exact same, with each scary scene simply being one of them popping up on the screen for 0.5 seconds, using the same overly distorted images, only this time they're superimposed over live action, found footage style segments. It is a bit cooler, and they're hand-drawn instead of sloppy Photoshop jobs. But with this series, even if I found the whole spooky face thing scary, there's just very little meaningful plot or sense of suspense to grasp onto here. And even then you could argue the few interesting elements like the found footage of Bassworld or the extraterrestrial origin of the smile tape virus are themselves taken wholesale from other series. To the average person viewing analog horror, it really felt like the vast majority of series had become an incestuous copy of a copy of a copy, to the point where all that remained was the same handful of tropes that we spammed over and over, somehow expected to still have the same effect. I can put 6 different series on screen right now, and if you hadn't seen them before, do you really think you could tell these apart? The content was getting tired, the viewers were getting tired, and outside of the very occasional standouts, this period felt like rock bottom for analog horror, and if you asked most average people, they'd likely say the genre was on the way out. In mid-2022, just as everyone was ready to write the genre off as a fad that had overstayed its welcome and used up every potential variation, the Backrooms found footage dropped. Created by Kane Pixels, this was something completely new to the analog horror world. It totally discarded almost every trope that had come to define the genre. This series is a narrative-driven sci-fi story told mainly through archived footage by the Async Corporation, who discovered and are researching / attempting to utilize the Backrooms for profit. Whereas previous series all took other analog horror as their main inspiration to base their series off of, this takes inspiration from the viral liminal space trend married to the Backrooms that took over the internet during the pandemic. The fear from liminal spaces comes from a place that's totally opposite to where most analog horror series did. It's an unnerving, subtle sense of unease we feel from empty, transitionary spaces, with a lack of direction or other people for your mind to grasp onto. And that very specific feeling that emanates from liminal spaces is perfectly captured within the very first upload of this series. It sees you following someone exploring the vast, empty space of the Backrooms, featuring it and a few other famous liminal spaces that are perfectly recreated in this insanely fresh and immersive, photorealistic 3D animation style. And really, that's most of the video. There is a lingering thread of this lanky black monster that appears from time to time, but the fear of this video is almost purely based off the atmosphere you feel from all those infamous liminal space images brought into reality. And as the series goes on, not only are the visuals constantly improving, but that along with the lore of the company behind this that is so well realized and realistically handled, with crazy high quality acting and how every episode provides some world building that ties back into the previous and following episodes, it truly does make it feel like the Backrooms are like a real place, and us watching these tapes are discovering some crazy underground conspiracy that we're not supposed to know about. I mean, there's a recent upload that's, I am not kidding, 8 minutes of examining a freaking fluorescent light from the Backrooms, and the world building here is so well done that it's actually gripping, and probably is my favorite upload of the series for how it takes such a small, seemingly boring aspect of its world and expands upon it so much, truly making the world of the series tangible, and thus the people within it, and even the more out there elements, like the crazy monsters, much more believable and scary by proxy. So I consider this series to be the beginning of Generation 3 of analog horror, the one we're in now, as it ended up being a really fresh take on the genre that was just as influential and popular as series like Local 58 and the Mandela Catalog were for their respective series. The main changes brought by the Backrooms, I'd say, for one is its pioneering of the hyper-realistic 3D areas it created, and most notably, moving even further than any previous series into focusing hard on the plot and world building aspect, as despite the constant unease from the Backrooms whenever we get to explore them, this series has the confidence in its writing to let really a majority of its episodes sit as purely lore-driven expansions with no big scares to speak of. I can certainly understand if someone considers that a negative, since the analog horror series doesn't have much horror in it, but I think the restraint very much works in the series' favor. As I've said, the detailed and well thought out world building ends up making everything much more intimidating. And being tethered to the horror aspect, feeling the need to cap off every episode with an arbitrary jump scare would just ruin the immersion it's been doing such an amazing job establishing so far. So yeah, The Backrooms. Great series. Really happy to see it grow as big as it has, lifting the whole genre back up along with it. So now, let's see what kind of new and interesting content it inspired. So, much like the Mandela catalog, if you have a series become especially popular online, you'll inevitably have others try to emulate it. Only with previous clones, they were at least made by fans who were inspired. They just maybe didn't quite have the ability to make it different enough or stand on its own yet. But The Backrooms has a lot of clones, and to me at least, these don't feel like someone who wants to make their own series because of how much they love the original. No, these are just straight up rip-off, off-brand, Walmart backroom videos. Literally one-to-one copying the pacing and ideas from the most popular and easy to replicate portions of the Backrooms, the found footage segments. And I mean, these are really blatant, and totally forgo any of the subtly present in Kane series, instead opting to shove in these ridiculous giant monsters that all have the same general design and screaming gimmick that completely ruin the whole lonely, off-putting feel of the Backrooms. Lacking any world building or pacing, it's a really surface level recreation, clearly made cynically to appeal and profit off of, well, kids that got into Kane series but didn't really grasp more complex storytelling, rather just know about the spooky monsters and cool imagery, resulting in these getting millions upon millions of views. A lot of them more than the actual series they're copying. To be fair, I can't see how people find these appealing, as they do adapt a lot of different liminal spaces and stuff that's popular within the Backrooms wiki, as there is this whole Backrooms community distinct from Kane Pixel's series that formed around the same time, kind of being a spiritual successor to the SCP Foundation, with countless different fan-made levels and entities. Although much like these series that tend to lift from it, having all those over-the-top monsters running around, for me and a lot of other people, totally ruins the appeal of the Backrooms and liminal spaces in general, when the lack of anything there is what creates the very unique, off-putting feeling that makes them so creepy. But okay, I don't want to get lost in the whole liminal space debate. The point is, in the analog horror space, things were beginning to become, once again, monotonous clones that only served to harm the name of the amazing series that had inspired them in the first place. And that's not to mention how the popularity of the Backrooms resulted in it being latched onto by soulless content farms that spam these insanely awful videos just hopping on keywords to draw in kids. Like Spider-Man in the Backrooms, Sonic in the Backrooms, Huggy Wuggy in the Backrooms. Like, it's obviously stupid, but there's no denying all this stuff kinda diluted how people saw the Backrooms and somewhat analog horror as a whole. And I feel like also around this time, although there are already memes based off of stuff like the Mandela catalog before, they are more out of admiration, in the same way any popular media gets memes made of it. But by this point in time, people were just straight up mocking the whole analog horror genre with stuff like this, analog horror starter packs, and tons of other parodies. It just made the whole thing a laughingstock really, as despite the few great stories true fans were aware of, to any casual observer who just remembered watching Local 58 and the Walton Files back in the day, it seemed like almost all modern analog horror was just try-hard, repetitive, unscary trash that only kids found scary. I believe this new reputation of analog horror resulted in it going in two distinct directions at the same time. One leaning into the more broad audience appeal, by and for younger audiences, and another desperately trying to prove itself as something mature and disturbing. And for that second direction, there's one series that perfectly represents the idea taken to its logical extreme. Urban Spooks The Painter. Now, out of every analog horror here, this is probably the most widely covered, and none of that coverage is very positive, so I'm going to keep this brief. The Painter is essentially a very bare-bones collection of VHS tapes documenting the investigation into the titular Painter, a serial killer who creates these crazy abstract paintings depicting his victims after they've been killed. And besides the minor plot thread of there being two killers and a few one-dimensional reoccurring characters that are really just names to be quickly killed off, well, there's really no plot here. Literally all this series is, for the vast majority of its runtime, is very simple text on a black screen, giving like a sentence or two of context, before describing the edgiest, most over-the-top try-hard ways the painter killed someone. Then it'll read something like, "And this is the painting the killer left," showing something like this. And every single episode follows that same format. I've criticized previous series for lacking build-up and reason for the scares, but the Smile tapes look like The Shining compared to this. From the very first episode, the series is throwing these insanely grotesque and elaborate murder descriptions at you, and it's really the only thing it has to offer, so while the idea is potentially disturbing at first, as it goes on it has to push them so far that it becomes absolutely laughable. And with the extreme topics the series touches on, combined with the absurdly heavy-handed manner they're presented, along with urban spook just generally being kinda disliked within the community, this series garnered tons of drama, further spreading the series and worsening the already dismal perception of analog horror as a whole. I do feel like people go a little too hard on the guy, and I wanted to come in here playing devil's advocate so I'm not just beating a dead horse. But to be honest, this series is kind of hard to defend. I mean, I will say the actual paintings are pretty cool as standalone pieces of artwork. He's clearly a far more talented artist than a storyteller. And after sitting through the whole series again for this video, the latest episode does feature one scene that actually made me feel something other than unintended laughter or pure boredom from how desensitizing the constant gore was. It only took 8 episodes, with presumably the next being the finale, but in general the direction for episode 8 features at least some plot progression to latch onto and much more elaborate visuals than the rest. And actually seeing the killers in person at the scene of one of their trademark ultra gory murders and hearing the honestly bone-rattling screams of their victim was genuinely spooky. Even if that's mostly just from the loud-ass screaming in my ear, which is a bit of a cheap trick admittedly. So yeah, if Urban Spook is still wanting to make analog horror even after all the relentless criticism he's gotten over this, I think with maybe a collaborator to help with the writing and rein in the edge a little bit, or a lot, and leaning into the awesome artwork he's capable of, I think he could produce something good in the future. On the other side, we saw a series leaning into this new, what I can only describe as creepypasta-esque direction for analog horror. Around this time you started to see more and more series that take the basic look of analog horror, but make it about some kind of popular kids franchise. Of course there was already stuff like the FNAF VHS series, but in that case it was using the analog aesthetic in a way that made sense for the story it was trying to tell, was actually good, and added tons of new techniques that expanded the genre as a whole. However, for these projects, they really do come off the same as those endless lost episode stories that practically killed the creepypasta genre back in the day. Only really using the franchises as a gimmick to get attention, but the actual videos are totally lacking any substance or original ideas, making it feel like it wouldn't have any traction at all if it wasn't for coasting off the idea of some popular kid-friendly franchise being totally messed up and edgy. Batman Analog Horror is a series that gained a lot of traction earlier this year, and tons of those reaction analysis videos claimed it to be absolutely horrific. But in reality, to me at least, it's the most basic what if hero was actually evil and he killed all the other characters plot, presented in the most generic way possible, with dry text on a black background, with the same simple infographics and bland descriptions of how Batman killed X character, with no motivation or consequence, over and over again, only broken up by the occasional ear rape jump scares that make zero sense in the context of this being a supposed VHS police report. The Nickelodeon hijacking incident, probably the most infamous example of this, is a fake hijacking of an airing of SpongeBob. That is 20 seconds of a glitchy recording before transitioning into a hijacking by a grammatically challenged ghost. That is supposed to be the wife of SpongeBob's real-life deceased creator, Steven Hillenburg, and she's asking why he murdered her, before assaulting your eyes with another obnoxious jump scare, and ending on this tasteless image. Okay, you get the point. There are a lot of these, but besides that last one, I do think these projects are largely inoffensive. Judging by the surface level imitation and the suspiciously common misspelling of words, I believe a lot of them are made by kids or people that are at least new to the genre, and we all have to start from somewhere. Really, that goes for any of the series I criticized here. At the end of the day, even a basic analog horror video requires way more effort to create than I think most people realize, and no one can make something perfect on their first try. Art is an iterative process, and it takes courage to put your stuff out there. So even for the series I dislike, I hold great respect for those who made them, and I know they all have the potential to make something better in the future. But the thing is, just as with creepypasta, the sheer amount of these and how popular some of them ended up being. Well, it just really dilutes the genre, which I think is a shame, because despite everything, there are still great analog horror out there that I think are much more deserving of the recognition, not only to recognize their efforts but also to help improve the worsening image of the analog horror genre as a whole. The Man in the Suit is one of the only examples of an analog horror based on a pre-existing franchise I've somewhat enjoyed. Although it uses the same simple text-based presentation, the story it tells is really quite unique and fun. At its core, it's a story about how the actor portraying Godzilla freaking explodes inside his suit and gets melded together with it, seemingly taking on Godzilla's characteristics and wreaking havoc on the set of various films, with each one becoming a more and more disastrous production. The concept is pretty crazy, obviously, yet as the series continues, there are actually some really cool and unique ideas here that keep it engaging. Even if it's not exactly my favorite, a lot of people really connected with this, and I'm happy to see it getting a good amount of recognition. As the main reason I wanted to highlight this series, even if it has the same basic presentation as a lot of the previous series I criticized, I want to illustrate just because something utilizes the typical analog horror tropes doesn't automatically make it bad. Why that feels like such a problem in other series is because that's all they have, whereas there's clearly a lot of passion and thought put into Man in the Suit, but they're relying on progressively more out there, disturbing ideas and its rising stakes to create fear and intrigue, rather than just the same old cheap jump scares or egregious gore. Now, to end, I want to look at something that not only stands on its own as a truly exceptional piece of modern analog horror, but also is a great example for a potential positive direction the genre could head in the future. This series truly is totally unlike any other in the genre. To give its very basic pitch, it follows someone rediscovering a cartoon from their childhood. Only upon rewatching the old tapes he's recorded of it as a child, something's off. It appears the main character, a super cute bunny girl named Gabby, was directly communicating with him through the TV. Now, I know upon hearing that you probably already have an idea of where these kind of possessed childhood media stories usually go, but let me tell you, it does not go in the direction you're expecting. I really don't want to spoil anymore, so it's a little hard to discuss this one, but for an analog horror series, this will make you feel much more complex and different emotions than just the usual unsettling fear or intrigue, although it does a great job establishing that too. The way the videos are presented, while still maintaining the spirit of analog horror, are just way beyond the usual approach. With a clearly very experienced team at the helm, it has not only super high quality animation that you can see on screen now, but also great voice acting and a storyline that's so engaging and unpredictable there's no way you can stop after just 1 or 2 episodes. There's currently 3 arcs of this story, each presented in the form of 6 2 to 5 minute episodes. So if you haven't, it's worth at least checking out the first arc, as by the end it comes together in a way that's gotta be one of the most satisfying and emotional payoffs of any online story I've seen, period. And without spoiling anything, the way it completely reinvents itself with each arc is just awesome. So I say this series sets a good example for the future of analog horror, not because of its impressive production values, as it's unrealistic to expect just anyone to make something of this quality themselves without years and years of practice, but rather because of how it's a fresh new idea and a story the creators are passionate to tell first, and an analog horror second. Meaning it doesn't feel the need to include the usual tropes just because that kind of stuff is what analog horror is supposed to have. It simply takes the aspects of it that will support the atmosphere and world it wants to create, while ignoring the usual mainstays that wouldn't fit into the story it's telling. I think for future creators, that approach of focusing on what unique idea you and only you have, what scares you, what fascinates you, and how you feel it best makes sense to show that within your abilities first. Then taking inspiration from the creators you love in the field, and not just copying their ideas wholesale, but adapting them to fit your unique world and tastes. I think as Angel Hair and other series like The Backrooms and even the Mandela Catalog show, that approach can result in making something very special that not only can connect with so many people in a meaningful way, but also can lift up and push the whole genre forward, inspiring future creators to do the same.